Last week, presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders pledged an end to prosecuting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. While the law is more than 100 years old, in the past 10 years or so, it's been used by both President Trump and President Obama more than a dozen times.
In a piece that appeared in the Intercept, Sanders laid out his thoughts on the matter, saying, quote, "If somebody has the courage to be a whistleblower, I think that person should be supported." Joining us now via Skype to weigh in on this and the other happenings in Washington is Intercept journalist Glenn Greenwald. Glenn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you guys.
Absolutely. So, Glenn, just first your reaction to that news about Sanders. I know you've been a long defender of whistleblowers. Do you worry, however, that it could have some, are there bad national security implications of this decision?
No, the Espionage Act is one of the most pernicious laws that we have anywhere in the United States Code. The history of it is evil. I mean, it was enacted 2 months after the U.S. entered World War II, and Woodward Wilson, who was its primary champion, Woodward Wilson was its primary champion, said when it was enacted that it was designed to ensure that Americans of German ancestry didn't engage in subversive action, and then it was used principally to criminalize dissent against the U.S. involvement in that war, and has been used in increasingly repressive ways ever since. There are a lot of other laws that make it a crime to disseminate classified information without authorization, but this was born of very bad motives, anti-democratic and repressive ones, and has been used in that way for the last 9 or 10 decades, and really has no business being used against people who leak classified information to journalists who aren't in any sense engaged in espionage or spying.
And talk about how it's been ramped up in the past 2 administrations.
Yeah, well, prior to President Obama, there had only been 3 cases of the Espionage Act being used against people who were leakers, one of which was Daniel Ellsberg, who, and this is what makes the Espionage Act so pernicious, wanted to go on the stand and essentially defend himself by saying, yes, I absolutely leaked the Pentagon Papers. And the reason I did it was because it was justified, because these secrets never should have been kept from the American public in the first place. And the judge ruled that he had no right even to raise that as a defense, that it's a strict liability crime, that if you disseminate information without authorization that the government says is secret, it doesn't matter why you did it. There's no defenses available along the lines of you are correcting government abuses or exposing crimes. You're automatically guilty. So there were only 3 cases of the Espionage Act being used that way when President Obama took office, and he used it in 9 or 10 cases. So basically triple the number of all prior presidents combined prosecuting leakers under the Espionage Act. And the Trump administration has now picked up that mantle and is prosecuting multiple sources, including several of the intercepts, under the same law, which is what makes it so insidious.
So, Glenn, I also wanted to ask you about this raid on Bakr al-Baghdadi. You've been talking about how it's difficult for many Democrats in order to give the president credit for the raid, but you've also been talking about how many of the details of the raid we should be very suspect of coming out in the initial days. Just your reaction to that news.
I mean, the stench of hypocrisy from Democrats on how they're reacting to this is so suffocating. I could barely even watch it happen because it was nauseating. They literally and explicitly constructed Obama's re-election campaign. At least half of it was of the slogan was around the fact that he killed a leader of a designated terrorist group, Osama bin Laden. The phrase was bin Laden is dead and GM is alive. They celebrated in the streets like it was the football championship when Obama announced that they had killed this old and decrepit man who was unarmed at the time that he was killed. So you would think if they had even like an iota of integrity, they would react similarly to the killing of Baghdadi, and yet they didn't. They immediately started searching for ways to malign Trump for how he announced it or what he said, and tried to turn it into some sort of Russia scandal because he thanked the Russians who actually helped and participated in the operation the way that presidents for decades have done when they cooperate with the Russians. But, you know, I had the same reaction as I had to the killing of bin Laden, which is in general, these kind of flourishes, these dramatic killings of prominent terrorists give people a sense of catharsis, but they don't really do much, unfortunately, to end this endless war on terror. In fact, they kind of end up fueling it because it gives Americans this pulsating sense of strength and power and success and satisfaction, almost like a bloodthirsty quench that has to be satisfied over and over, and it just further makes them believe in the cause of bombing people under the name of terrorism. So if anything, it has the opposite effect, and it doesn't stop terrorism because they just replace the leader with somebody else. But it has this effect of, I think, elevating militarism in the United States.
And what did you make of the media coverage of this terrorist killing versus bin Laden?
I mean, it's really pitiful how reliant mainstream media outlets now are on intelligence agencies and intelligence operatives. They essentially use the CIA and their various affiliates as their principal source for how they understand and then report the news. And it's almost always done anonymously. And obviously those agencies hate Donald Trump almost as much as these media outlets do. So it's this kind of perfect unity, this political alliance between the news media on the one hand and the intelligence and security state agencies on the other. So they started immediately leaking, kind of giving the Democrats the fuel about how to malign Trump for what was obviously, from the perspective of mainstream opinion frameworks, a successful operation, leaking that they were able to do this not because of Trump, but despite him, that he was opposed to the very programs that allowed them to find al-Baghdadi in the first place. And the New York Times and the Washington Post just instantly began, after a couple of hours of stumbling around trying to figure out what to say, framing their news coverage based on the CIA's attacks on Trump, saying essentially that this happened not because of Trump, but despite him. And it just shows how closely unified this dark world of what I'll call the deep state, but what you can call, the kind of national security blob or whatever you want to call it, is with the U.S. media. In the past, during the Cold War, it used to be very kind of clandestine. They used to be embarrassed about infiltration by the CIA into news outlets and newsrooms, and now they're very open about it. Most news outlets openly use these sources as their principal sources for how to understand the world.
Well, and I think what's important to both of you, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts, is that what's different is that the national security blob is now at odds with the administration, where normally their spin is in support of the administration. So, I mean, look, the CIA has a long history of using the press basically as their plaything to get out whatever propaganda they want to. But the context, Sagar, that's often missing is that now, really for the first time, they're at odds with the administration. And that's just something to, when you're reading these articles, that's just something to keep in mind, that they have an axe to grind.
And Glenn, you've been pointing this out, which is that so many of the guests and employees of these mainstream networks are former spooks themselves, like former directors of the CIA, former heads of these national security agencies. And yet you have, I think, CNN's Jeff Zucker accusing Fox News of being state-run media. I mean, I think you had perhaps the best take on this, which is you see former officials coming to commentate on the news is a definition of what state-run media can look like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ironies. I mean, as Crystal said, like, there always has been tension between presidents and these agencies like the CIA, and they've been very successful at keeping them in line, because remember, presidents come and then they go, and they're only there for 4 years or 8 years, whereas these agencies are there forever. So they know how to operate in the dark much more insidiously and effectively than these politicians do, and are more powerful than they are. That's what Dwight Eisenhower warned about 60 years ago when he left office. That's what he chose to warn us about, was the military-industrial complex becoming more powerful even than democratically elected leaders. That was before Vietnam, obviously before the war on terror, before the massive expansion of all these agencies even further. And I think Crystal makes a really interesting point, which is in the past, presidents have accommodated them, right? Obama ran for office pledging to reverse all these programs that he then ended up keeping in place. How come? Because they coerced him successfully, or persuaded him, or cajoled him to do so, whereas Trump is much more difficult to control. And I still find one of the most significant and enlightening exchanges to be back in January of 2017, either days before or days after Trump's inauguration, when he went on Twitter and mocked the CIA for having gotten Iraqi WMD wrong. And then Chuck Schumer went on Rachel Maddow and said, just as a pragmatic matter, it's really stupid for Trump to pick a fight with the intelligence community because, as he put it, they have 6 different ways to Sunday to get back at you. Basically, not really threatening Trump, but just more kind of informing him that they'd be in open warfare with him, which is, I think, what has defined the Trump presidency for 3 years. The scandals, Russiagate, now Ukraine, all these stuff leaking about Baghdadi, all comes from these agencies that he's been at war with. And what makes it most disturbing is exactly what you just said, which is that they are now pervading cable news networks, particularly MSNBC and CNN. Anytime anybody leaves the top level of the CIA or the NSA or the FBI, even when they leave under disgrace, like Andrew McCabe, they go directly, without stopping to pass go and collect $200, to one of those 2 cable networks, which now basically are just mouthpieces for those agencies.
Yeah. Well, Glenn, thank you so much for joining us.
Always great to talk to you, Glenn. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you guys. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Coming up, California Congresswoman Katie Hill resigns after facing scrutiny for an affair with a staffer. Was a double standard at work there?
And the Iowa caucus is just 98 days away. We're going to take a look at who's winning the horse race there and in another key state when Rising continues.